The serial killer called himself the cleaner because he believed he was cleaning up the streets by murdering homeless people. 7 victims in 4 months, all found in different locations, all killed with surgical precision. The victims were society's invisible people, no family to report them missing, no witnesses who cared enough to come forward, no one to demand justice for their deaths. This had to stop. Detective Sarah Williams knew that traditional police methods weren't working against a killer who specifically targeted people that society had already forgotten. So she proposed an idea that made her superior officers question her sanity. She would go undercover as a homeless woman herself. Chief Morrison sat across from Sarah in his office, his expression torn between admiration and concern. "Williams, I appreciate your dedication, and God knows we need a breakthrough on this case. But what you're suggesting isn't just dangerous, it's psychological suicide. You'd be cutting yourself off from everything that defines who you are. Your badge, your authority, your identity as a police officer." Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady with determination. "Chief, this killer is hunting people who are invisible to the rest of us. The only way to catch him is to become invisible myself. I need to think like his victims, live like his victims, and yes, become a potential victim." "And what happens when you've been on the streets for weeks, maybe months?" Morrison asked. "What happens when you start to forget that this is just an assignment? What happens when you become exactly what you're pretending to be?" Sarah met his gaze without flinch. "Then I'll have done my job right. But I'll catch him, Chief. I'll catch him because I'll be the only victim he encounters who can fight back." What Sarah didn't know was that 6 months later she would discover that Chief Morrison's warnings had been more prophetic than either of them could have imagined. Welcome to a story of identity, sacrifice, and the invisible people among us. Before we dive into Sarah's psychological journey, tell me in the comments, have you ever felt invisible in a crowd? And if you believe that some cases require everything an officer has to give, hit that subscribe button. This story will change how you see the homeless. Seattle's Pioneer Square had always been a gathering place for the city's homeless population. The historic district's covered sidewalks and numerous doorways provided shelter from the Pacific Northwest's constant rain, while nearby social services offered meals and basic health care. For many people living on the streets, Pioneer Square wasn't just a location, it was home. That's what made it such an ideal hunting ground for the cleaner. Detective Sarah Williams had been studying the case files for weeks, trying to find a pattern that might lead to the killer. 7 victims in 4 months, all homeless, all found in different locations throughout downtown Seattle. The murders showed a level of planning and execution that suggested someone with medical or military training. Victim 1, Marcus Rivera, 43. Found behind a dumpster near Pike Place Market. Cause of death, single stab wound to the heart, perfectly placed to cause immediate cardiac arrest. Victim 2, Linda Thompson, 38, discovered in an abandoned building on First Avenue. Same method, same precision. Victim 3, James Wilson, 51, found under the Alaskan Way Viaduct. Again, a single, perfectly placed wound. The pattern continued through all 7 victims. No forensic evidence, no witnesses, no apparent connection between the victims except their shared circumstance of homelessness. The killer was methodical, efficient, and completely invisible to the city's surveillance systems. Sarah's frustration grew with each crime scene she processed. The killer was targeting society's most vulnerable people, knowing that their deaths would generate minimal investigation and even less public outcry. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated executions carried out by someone who viewed homeless people as problems to be solved rather than human beings deserving protection. After the 7th victim was discovered, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. "Chief, I need to go undercover," Sarah announced as she entered Chief Morrison's office, carrying a thick file folder containing everything they knew about the cleaner case. Morrison looked up from his computer, noting the determined expression on Sarah's face. "Undercover as what? We've already tried placing officers at the shelters, monitoring the soup kitchens, increasing patrols in the areas where the bodies were found. This killer is too smart for conventional surveillance." Sarah set the file on Morrison's desk and opened it to a map of downtown Seattle, marked with red pins, indicating where each victim had been found. That's exactly my point, Chief. We've been trying to catch him using traditional police methods, but he's not hunting traditional victims. He's targeting people who are invisible to the rest of society. Morrison studied the map, seeing the pattern that Sarah had identified. The victims were found in locations that homeless people frequented, but not places where housed people would normally go. The killer wasn't just familiar with the homeless population. He was embedded within their world. What are you suggesting, William? Sarah took a deep breath before answering. I want to go undercover as a homeless woman. Live on the streets, sleep in the same places his victims sleep. Become part of the community he's hunting. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face for any sign that she was joking or hadn't fully thought through what she was proposing. Sarah, you're talking about giving up everything that makes you a police officer. Your badge, your weapon, your backup, your safety net. You'd be completely on your own in one of the most dangerous situations an officer can face. I'd have backup, Sarah replied. Detective Rodriguez would be my handler. We'd have check-in procedures, emergency protocols. Morrison shook his head. Check-ins with who? Rodriguez can't exactly meet you at police headquarters if you're supposed to be homeless. And emergency protocols. If this killer targets you, you won't have time to call for backup. Sarah leaned forward, her voice intense with conviction. Chief, 7 people are dead, and we're no closer to catching this killer than we were 4 months ago. Traditional police work isn't working because this isn't a traditional case. The killer is hunting people that society has forgotten exist. The only way to catch him is to become one of those people. Against his better judgment, Chief Morrison approved Sarah's undercover operation with strict conditions. She would have a handler, Detective Maria Rodriguez, who would monitor her progress and safety from a distance. They would establish secure communication protocols and emergency extraction procedures. Most importantly, the operation would have a maximum duration of 2 months. 2 months, Williams, Morrison emphasized during their final briefing. 60 days. After that, we extract you regardless of the case status. I won't have an officer lose herself on my watch. Sarah nodded, though privately she knew that 2 months might not be enough time to gain the trust of the homeless community and position herself where the cleaner might find her. The preparation for Sarah's transformation was more complex than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't enough to simply put on old clothes and sleep outside. She needed to become convincingly homeless in a way that would fool both the killer and the people she'd be living among. Sarah spent a week at a women's shelter, not as a police officer but as a volunteer, learning about the daily realities of homelessness. She spoke with women who had been on the streets for years, understanding their survival strategies, their social hierarchies, their unspoken rules. The most important thing, explained Jenny, a woman who had been homeless for 3 years, is to make yourself invisible to the housed people. Don't make eye contact, don't ask for help, don't do anything that reminds them you exist. The moment you become visible to them, you become a problem they want to solve or remove. Sarah also learned about the complex social structure within the homeless community. There were established territories, informal leadership hierarchies, and survival networks that could mean the difference between life and death during Seattle's harsh winters. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a psychiatrist who worked with homeless populations, briefed Sarah on the psychological challenges she would face. Officer Williams, what you're planning isn't just physically dangerous, it's psychologically devastating. When society treats you as invisible, when your basic humanity is denied day after day, it changes how you see yourself. After weeks or months of that treatment, many people begin to internalize the message that they don't matter. Sarah listened to these warnings, but remained committed to her mission. She couldn't save the 7 people who had already died, but she could prevent future murders by catching the cleaner. On a rainy Monday morning in October, Detective Sarah Williams ceased to exist, and Sarah, just Sarah, with no last name, no history, and no future beyond surviving each day, took her place on the streets of Seattle. The physical transformation had been carefully planned. Sarah's naturally brown hair was dyed black, and cut into an uneven, unkempt style. Her skin was artificially aged with makeup techniques, and her clothes were purchased from thrift stores and then artificially worn and stained. A small scar was added to her left cheek using theatrical makeup, and her posture was changed to reflect the weight-bearing stress of carrying everything she owned. But the psychological transformation began the moment Sarah walked away from her apartment for the last time, carrying only a worn backpack containing the basic necessities for survival. The first shock was the immediate loss of identity. Without her badge, her gun, or her police credentials, Sarah discovered that she was nobody. Store clerks looked through her rather than at her. Restaurant owners shooed her away from their doorsteps. Even other police officers, colleagues she had worked with for years, walked past her without recognition. The second shock was the cold. Seattle's October weather was harsh enough for housed people with heating systems and warm clothes. For someone sleeping in doorways with only a thin sleeping bag and whatever layers she could carry, the cold became a constant, painful presence that made clear thinking difficult and sleep nearly impossible. By her third day on the streets, Sarah understood why homeless people seem to move slowly and think sluggishly. When your body is constantly fighting hypothermia, hunger, and exhaustion, mental acuity becomes a luxury you can't afford. The social isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of her new existence. Sarah had always been a social person, comfortable talking with witnesses, suspects, and colleagues. But as a homeless woman, conversation became a rare commodity. Most housed people avoided eye contact, and many homeless people were too lost in their own survival struggles to engage with newcomers. Detective Rodriguez monitored Sarah's progress through carefully planned encounters. Once a week, Rodriguez would pose as a social worker conducting outreach, allowing her to check on Sarah's physical and mental condition. These brief meetings became lifelines for Sarah, reminders that she still existed in the world beyond the street. Gradually, Sarah began to be accepted by Seattle's homeless community. The process was slow and required her to prove that she could be trusted and that she understood the unwritten rules of street survival. Her breakthrough came when she helped an elderly homeless man named Frank during a particularly violent rainstorm. Frank had been trying to repair a tarp that served as his only shelter when the wind tore it from his hands. Sarah spent 2 hours in the rain helping him secure the tarp and gather his scattered belongings. "You're all right, Sarah," Frank told her afterward. "Stick with me, and I'll teach you how to survive out here." Frank became Sarah's guide to the invisible world of Seattle's homeless population. He taught her which doorways were safe, which police officers could be trusted, and which areas to avoid after dark. More importantly, he introduced her to the network of people who had been living on the streets for years. Through Frank, Sarah met Maria, a former nurse who had lost her job and housing after developing a prescription drug addiction. Maria still carried medical supplies in her backpack and served as an unofficial healthcare provider for people who couldn't access traditional medical services. She met Tommy, a Vietnam veteran, whose PTSD had made it impossible for him to maintain stable housing. Tommy had an encyclopedic knowledge of Seattle streets and could navigate the city using routes that avoided police patrols and hostile business owners. And she met Lisa, a young woman who had aged out of the foster care system and found herself on the streets with no family support and no job skills. Lisa had been homeless for only 6 months, but she had already developed the hard, suspicious demeanor that characterized long-term street survivors. As Sarah became integrated into this community, she began to understand why the cleaner had been able to operate undetected for so long. The homeless population lived in a parallel world that rarely intersected with housed society. Deaths within this community were often attributed to exposure, overdose, or violence related to mental illness. A methodical killer could operate for months or years without attracting attention from authorities. Sarah also began to understand the victims in a way that crime scene photographs and witness interviews could never convey. These weren't just statistics or case numbers. They were people with stories, dreams, and connections to others in the community. 6 weeks into her undercover assignment, Sarah encountered her first real lead in the cleaner case. She was sharing a meal at a downtown soup kitchen when she overheard a conversation between 2 homeless men discussing someone they called the doctor. "He's been asking questions again," one man whispered to another, "wanting to know who's new on the streets, who doesn't have family, who wouldn't be missed." Sarah's police instincts immediately activated. But she forced herself to remain calm and continue eating while listening to the conversation. The doctor was apparently a well-dressed man who occasionally appeared in areas where homeless people gathered. He claimed to be a social worker or medical professional conducting outreach, but his questions were unusual. Instead of asking about immediate needs like food or shelter, he focused on isolation and family connection. "He gave me $20 last week just for answering questions," the second man continued. "Wanted to know if I had family in Seattle, if anyone would look for me if I disappeared. Weird stuff." Sarah realized she might be hearing a description of the cleaner's victim selection process. A well-dressed professional could move through homeless areas without attracting suspicion, and his questions would help him identify the most vulnerable targets. During her next check-in with Detective Rodriguez, Sarah reported this lead. Rodriguez immediately began investigating anyone who might fit the description of the doctor, including legitimate social workers, medical professionals, and researchers who worked with homeless populations. But the investigation had to be conducted carefully. If word got out that police were looking for someone matching this description, the cleaner might simply change his approach or disappear entirely. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her life on the streets, knowing that she might have become a target herself. As a relatively new member of the homeless community with no family connections in Seattle, she fit the profile of the cleaner's previous victims. The thought was both terrifying and hopeful. If she could attract the cleaner's attention, she might finally have the opportunity to catch him. By her 10th week on the streets, Sarah Williams was disappearing even from her own mind. The constant cold, hunger, and exhaustion had worn down her physical resilience, but the psychological impact was even more devastating. The daily experience of being treated as invisible by housed people had begun to erode Sarah's sense of self-worth. Shop owners who shooed her away from their doorsteps, pedestrians who crossed the street to avoid her, police officers who moved her along without recognizing her humanity. Each interaction reinforced the message that she didn't matter. Sarah found herself beginning to believe it. During what should have been a routine check-in with Detective Rodriguez, Sarah's handler noticed alarming changes in her behavior and speech patterns. "Sarah, you've been out here for 10 weeks, Rodriguez said during their meeting at a bus stop downtown. The original timeline was 8 weeks maximum. Chief Morrison is ready to extract you." Sarah looked at Rodriguez with confusion, as if struggling to understand who she was talking to. "Extract me to where?" "Back to your life, Sarah. Back to your job, your apartment, your identity as a police officer." Sarah laughed, but the sound was hollow and bitter. "What life? What apartment? I live here now. This is who I am." Rodriguez realized that Chief Morrison's worst fears were coming true. Sarah was losing herself in the undercover role, beginning to identify more strongly with her homeless persona than with her previous identity as a police detective. "Sarah, you're Detective Sarah Williams with the Seattle Police Department. You have 12 years of experience, a commendation for valor, and a career that you've worked hard to build. This is just an assignment." But Sarah shook her head. Detective Williams had a warm bed and regular meals and people who treated her like a human being. "I don't remember what that feels like anymore." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Rodriguez trying to remind Sarah of her real identity while Sarah insisted that her life on the streets was her only reality. Finally, Rodriguez made the decision to recommend immediate extraction. "I'm calling this off, Sarah. You're coming in tonight." "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm close to catching him. The doctor has been seen again, asking questions about new people. I fit his profile perfectly. If you extract me now, he'll disappear forever." Rodriguez faced an impossible decision. Sarah was clearly suffering from psychological breakdown related to her extended undercover assignment, but she was also closer to catching the cleaner than they had ever been before. The decision was made for them 3 days later when Sarah encountered the doctor herself. She was sleeping in a doorway near Pike Place Market when someone gently shook her awake. Opening her eyes, Sarah saw a well-dressed man in his 40s kneeling beside her with what appeared to be genuine concern on his face. "Excuse me, are you all right?" he asked softly. "You've been sleeping here for a while, and it's getting quite cold." Sarah's police training immediately kicked in, though she was careful not to show any sign of recognition or suspicion. This man matched the description of the doctor perfectly. Well-dressed, professional demeanor, and apparent concern for homeless individuals. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, adopting the defensive posture she had learned from other homeless women. "Just trying to stay dry." The man introduced himself as Dr. Richard Hayes, claiming to be a psychiatrist who worked with homeless populations as part of a research study. He offered Sarah money for food in exchange for answering some questions about her experiences on the streets. The questions started innocuously enough. How long had she been homeless? What services had she used? What were her biggest challenges? But gradually, the inquiries became more personal and more specific to the cleaner's apparent victim selection criteria. "Do you have family in the Seattle area?" Dr. Hayes asked. "Anyone who might be looking for you or expecting to hear from you regularly?" Sarah answered honestly from her homeless persona's perspective. "No family. No one who would miss me." "What about friends from before you became homeless? Former coworkers, neighbors, anyone who might report you missing if you disappeared?" The question sent chills down Sarah's spine, but she maintained her role. "There's nobody. I'm pretty much invisible." Dr. Hayes nodded sympathetically, but Sarah noticed something cold in his eyes that didn't match his concerned expression. "That must be very isolating. But you know, invisibility can also be a kind of freedom, can't it? Freedom from the expectations and judgments of society." As the conversation continued, Sarah became increasingly certain that she was talking to the cleaner. His questions were too specific, too focused on isolation and vulnerability. More importantly, his philosophical comments about invisibility and freedom from society matched the psychological profile that police psychologists had developed. But Sarah was in a dangerous position. She was alone, at night, in a secluded location, talking to a serial killer who believed she was a perfect victim. Her backup was nowhere near, and she had no way to signal for help without revealing her true identity. Hayes concluded their conversation by offering Sarah something that should have been completely innocent: a warm meal and a safe place to sleep for the night. "I work with a private organization that helps homeless individuals transition to permanent housing," he explained. "We have a facility where you could get cleaned up, have a hot meal, and sleep in a real bed while we discuss your options." Every instinct Sarah had developed as a police officer told her that accepting this invitation would likely result in her death. But every instinct she had developed as an undercover officer told her that this might be her only opportunity to gather evidence against the cleaner. "That sounds too good to be true," Sarah replied, maintaining her homeless persona while stalling for time to think. "I understand your suspicion," Dr. Hayes said. "People in your situation have been disappointed many times before. But I assure you, this is legitimate. I've helped dozens of people over the past few years." The phrase "dozens of people" struck Sarah as significant. If Dr. Hayes was the cleaner, he might be unconsciously referencing his victims rather than people he had actually helped. Sarah made a decision that would either crack the case or end her life. "Okay," she said. "I'll come with you." Dr. Hayes smiled, and for a moment, Sarah saw something predatory in his expression before his professional mask returned. "Excellent. My car is just around the corner." As they walked toward his vehicle, Sarah tried to memorize every detail that might help other officers track them: the car's make and model, the license plate number, the route they were taking. She also tried to find opportunities to leave evidence of her presence. A hair elastic dropped near his car, fingernail scratches on the door handle, anything that might help investigators if she didn't survive the night. The car ride took them away from downtown Seattle, toward an industrial area south of the city. Dr. Hayes maintained pleasant conversation during the drive, asking more questions about Sarah's background and experiences. But Sarah noticed that his questions continued to focus on her isolation and the absence of anyone who might look for her. "It's remarkable how invisible homeless people become," Dr. Hayes commented as they drove through empty streets. "Society simply stops seeing them as human beings. In many ways, they're already dead to the world." Sarah realized that Dr. Hayes was beginning to reveal his true philosophy. The same mentality that had led him to view homeless people as expendable and to call himself the cleaner. Dr. Hayes's facility turned out to be an abandoned warehouse in an industrial district, where no one would hear screams or notice unusual activity. As soon as they entered the building, Sarah knew she was in mortal danger. The warehouse had been converted into what could only be described as a torture chamber disguised as a medical facility. Surgical equipment, restraints and medical charts covered tables throughout the space. But most chilling were the photographs covering one wall. Pictures of all 7 victims, taken before and after their deaths. "Welcome to my clinic," Dr. Hayes said, his professional facade finally dropping completely. "This is where I've been conducting my research into urban population control." Sarah realized that Dr. Hayes genuinely believed he was performing a public service by murdering homeless people. In his twisted mind, he was a scientist conducting research rather than a serial killer hunting victims. "You see, Sarah," Hayes continued, beginning to prepare medical equipment, "society has a homeless problem that traditional methods can't solve. Shelters and social services only enable the behavior. What's needed is a more permanent solution." As Dr. Hayes talked, Sarah scanned the warehouse for anything she could use as a weapon or means of escape. But he had clearly learned from experience. The space was designed to prevent resistance or flight. "The beauty of my method," Dr. Hayes explained, "is that it's completely undetectable. I select individuals who won't be missed, eliminate them humanely, and dispose of their bodies in ways that suggest natural causes or accidental death. I'm providing a service to society while ending their suffering." Sarah realized that she was listening to a confession that would convict Hayes of multiple murders, if she survived to testify. But she was restrained, alone, and facing a killer who had successfully murdered 7 people without leaving evidence. Her only advantage was that Dr. Hayes still believed she was a helpless homeless woman rather than a trained police officer. Dr. Hayes's mistake was assuming that Sarah would be passive and compliant like his previous victims. When he approached with a syringe containing what he described as a humane sedative, Sarah was ready for him. The combat training that Sarah had received during her police academy years came back instantly. As Dr. Hayes leaned over her, Sarah broke free from her restraints, which were designed to hold someone weakened by months on the streets, not someone with police defensive tactics training. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate. Dr. Hayes was larger and stronger than Sarah, but she had training in the desperation of someone fighting for her life. More importantly, she knew that he had killed 7 people and would kill more if she didn't stop him. Sarah managed to reach a scalpel from Dr. Hayes's medical equipment and used it to defend herself when he tried to overpower her. The wound she inflicted wasn't fatal, but it was enough to disable him temporarily and allow her to reach the warehouse's exit. But Sarah faced a dilemma. If she simply escaped and called for backup, Dr. Hayes might flee before officers could arrest him. She needed to ensure that he was captured while also getting evidence of his crimes. Using a cell phone that Dr. Hayes had taken from one of his victims, Sarah called Detective Rodriguez and gave her the warehouse's location. Then she returned to confront Dr. Hayes, knowing that she needed to keep him in place until backup arrived. The final confrontation lasted another 10 minutes, with Sarah using everything she had learned about suspect apprehension to keep Dr. Hayes restrained and prevent his escape. When Seattle police officers finally arrived at the warehouse, they found Sarah holding the cleaner at gunpoint with evidence of 7 murders spread throughout the facility. Dr. Richard Hayes was arrested and charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence found in his warehouse was overwhelming. Photographs of all his victims, detailed records of his selection process, and surgical equipment used in the killings. During his trial, Hayes continued to maintain that his actions were justified as a form of population control. He showed no remorse for his victims, and expressed frustration that society couldn't understand his research. "These people were already dead to society," Hayes testified. "I simply made their condition official while relieving them of their suffering." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Hayes was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. But Sarah's victory came at a tremendous personal cost. Her 12 weeks undercover had fundamentally changed her perspective on homelessness, society, and her own identity as a police officer. The psychological evaluation that followed her extraction revealed significant trauma related to her extended isolation and dehumanization. Carter, the psychiatrist who had warned her about the psychological risks, recommended extensive therapy and a gradual reintegration process. Officer Williams experienced a form of identity dissolution that we typically see in prisoners of war or kidnapping victims. Carter explained to Chief Morrison. She spent months being treated as invisible and worthless, and those messages became internalized despite her training and preparation. Sarah's return to her normal life was more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Her apartment felt foreign and excessive after months of carrying everything she owned in a backpack. Regular meals seemed wasteful when she remembered friends on the streets who were hungry. Most challenging, the casual way that housed people ignored homeless individuals now felt like a personal assault. Sarah's experience undercover changed not only her life, but her entire approach to police work. She could no longer walk past homeless individuals without seeing them as people with stories and struggles rather than problems to be managed. 6 months after the cleaner's conviction, Sarah requested a transfer to the Seattle Police Department's Community Outreach Division, where she could work directly with homeless populations and social service organizations. "I can't go back to regular detective work," Sarah told Chief Morrison during their meeting. "After living on the streets, I understand these people in a way that no amount of training could have taught me. I want to use that understanding to help." Sarah's new position involved bridging the gap between law enforcement and homeless services. She worked with social workers to address crime within homeless communities, trained other officers on effective interaction with homeless individuals, and served as a liaison between police and advocacy organizations. Her unique experience made her invaluable in this role. When homeless individuals were victims of crimes, they were more likely to trust Sarah because she understood their world. When housed people complained about homeless encampments, Sarah could explain the human reality behind what they perceived as problems. Sarah's undercover operation and the capture of the cleaner had ripple effects throughout Seattle's approach to crimes involving homeless populations. The case demonstrated that homeless individuals could be victims of sophisticated predators who exploited their vulnerability and society's indifference. New protocols were established for investigating deaths within the homeless community. What had previously been quickly attributed to exposure, overdose, or accident now received more thorough investigation to rule out homicide. Training programs for police officers were updated to include education about homeless populations and the specific challenges they faced. Sarah frequently served as an instructor in these programs, sharing her experiences and helping officers understand the humanity behind the stereotypes. The case also led to improved cooperation between law enforcement and social service organizations. Recognizing that crime prevention within homeless populations required addressing basic needs like shelter, food, and health care, the police department began working more closely with service providers. Sarah's story became a case study in law enforcement training programs across the country. Her experience illustrated both the potential value and the significant risks of extended undercover operations, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. Detective Williams' operation was successful in catching a dangerous killer, noted Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a criminologist who studied the case. But it also demonstrated the psychological costs that officers can face when they become deeply embedded in the communities they're trying to protect. The case raised important questions about the ethics and safety of undercover operations that required officers to experience genuine hardship and dehumanization. 3 years after the cleaner's conviction, Sarah continued to work with Seattle's homeless population, but she had also become a national expert on crimes involving vulnerable populations. She consulted with police departments across the country on cases involving serial predators who targeted homeless, elderly, or mentally ill victims. "The most important lesson from my experience," Sarah told a conference of law enforcement professionals, "is that invisible people make invisible victims. Predators understand this and exploit it. If we want to protect vulnerable populations, we have to start by seeing them as human beings worthy of protection." Sarah's advocacy work extended beyond law enforcement. She worked with city planners to design public spaces that accommodated homeless individuals without criminalizing their presence. She consulted with business owners on approaches to homelessness that balanced legitimate concerns with human dignity. Her most meaningful work was with homeless individuals themselves. Sarah regularly visited encampments and service centers, checking on people she had met during her undercover assignment, and helping newcomers navigate the challenges of street life. "Sarah saved my life," said Frank, the elderly homeless man who had been her guide during her early weeks on the streets, "not just from the cleaner but from giving up hope." When someone who used to be a cop treats you like a human being, it reminds you that you still matter. Sarah's relationship with the homeless community remained complex. Some people appreciated her advocacy and understood her sacrifice. Others viewed her with suspicion, seeing her police background as incompatible with their experiences of law enforcement. "I'll never fully belong to their world," Sarah acknowledged. "But I'll never fully belong to the housed world either. My experience changed me in ways that can't be undone. And I think that's appropriate given what I learned." Today, Richard Hayes remains in prison, where he continues to write lengthy treatises about population control and urban planning. His requests for interviews are consistently denied, and his attempts to justify his crimes are ignored by the academic community he once sought to impress. Sarah Williams continues her work with Seattle's homeless population, but she also serves as a reminder of the psychological costs that law enforcement officers sometimes pay to protect society's most vulnerable members. The warehouse where Hayes conducted his murders has been converted into a homeless services center, providing meals, health care, and transitional housing assistance. A small plaque near the entrance reads, "In memory of 7 people who mattered, and in honor of those who risk everything to protect the forgotten." Sarah's story challenges us to examine our own attitudes toward homeless individuals and other vulnerable populations. Her experience undercover revealed not only the predators who exploit invisibility, but also the social conditions that make such exploitation possible. The real crime wasn't just what Dr. Hayes did to his victims. Sarah reflected during a recent interview. The real crime was how easy it was for him to do it because society had already decided these people didn't matter. Sarah's 12 weeks on the streets taught her that homelessness could happen to anyone, and that the line between housed and unhoused life was thinner than most people realized. Economic hardship, mental illness, addiction, or family crisis could push anyone into a world where they became invisible to the society they had once belonged to. So I ask you, how do you see homeless individuals in your community? Do you see them as people with stories and struggles, or as problems to be solved? Because Sarah Williams' story teaches us that our humanity is measured not by how we treat those who can help us, but by how we treat those who appear to have nothing to offer. If this story of sacrifice, transformation, and the invisible people among us moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that everyone matters. Subscribe to make sure you never miss stories that challenge us to see the world through different eyes. Remember, in a society that values visibility and success, sometimes the most important people are the ones we can't see. And sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting the monsters we fear, but becoming the people we've forgotten to value. The cleaner thought he was eliminating problems from society. Sarah Williams proved that he was murdering human beings who deserved protection, dignity, and justice. The difference between those two perspectives is the difference between civilization and barbarity.